and welcome to a World Cup edition of our chat with Poornima. I'm actually quite looking forward to it. We had a pre-recording discussion, and some of the information that she's going to share, I think I can keep listening to it for a long time to come. So thank you, Poornima. The pre-discussion now is going to be actual discussion. Let's bring this on. So the World Cup is coming and is starting in October. 4th of October is when India plays her first game. Every time we look at the World Cup, we are all going with a lot of hope and prayers for India as a fan, as a former player, everything. And then we say India as champions is such a dream. Yeah? Because to come there as champions, you beat teams like an Australia and you have to beat teams like an England who've always won. It's very surprising that an Asian team hasn't won the World Cup. It's been between Australia has landed their hands on the trophy maximum number of times, which is why every time they walk in, there's such an aura about them. There's an intimidating factor about them, and I think that kind of sets them apart. So we were talking about this, and we're going to talk to all of you about it. A champion mindset.
Right.
What's that all about?
A champion mindset in this space is very heavily built on, for the lack of a better word, a story armor. The Western teams basically have a story armor that's there around them that says, hey, you know what? We can't be defeated. If that is the case, we'll put up a hard fight. That's essentially it. Versus a team that has not reached a semi-final space or has not reached the final space comes in with a lot of skepticism as can we? Is it possible? And so on. So it feels like a much higher or a taller reach for players, for the teams that have not made it, versus the players who've already established, the teams that have already established, comes in with the feeling of it's either easy and we can dominate the flow. So that essentially is the difference between a champion mindset.
So how is it that this Australian team is able to be as sustained as they have? You're talking about the story armor, everything that we can win. But to be as consistent. They've had different captains, they've had different coaches, but that mindset that they have, it seems like wealth has been passed on from generation to retain it.
Right. So one, like you said, it's something can come from an inheritance. You've seen it, you've been in it, you've modeled it, so therefore you have it by the time you've reached the forefront of your game and so on. But I can't comment on the Australian team per se, but what also happens is that there are three specific places that we can look out and we can change how we behave that will help us reach that mindset as well.
Is it something you think they already have, whatever you're going to talk about? It's something that a bigger team like an Australian team,
absolutely,
they already have?
Absolutely.
Which you say can also be brought upon in the teams that are yet to go into that space.
Yes.
Okay.
It's a learned habit. It is a habit that we learn.
Okay.
And the sooner we learn it, the easier it is for us to manifest on the floor when we are in the place of performance. Number one is one of the most repeated themes that we have, how we see success versus failure. And very often than not, in our cultural context, success is often seen as a temporary thing or something that we have to keep doing to make sure it's there. And failure seems like a lot more permanent. So anytime we are achieving growth or we are achieving success, more than acknowledging it and feeling strong about it, most of us feel like we fear we might lose it or we fear we might decline. So very often, even if we reach success, we're a little bit more prone to feeling anxious about failure than we are towards success. So there, we need to create a slight bit of change and know that success is there. We can get it, we can keep getting it, and we can grow from that as well. So that, how do we go about doing that is one. The second element that comes in is the words that we use to describe success. Do we talk about successes as much as we talk about failures? We have a huge cultural element where we have to be humble, we don't brag, we don't, or if we talk about successes or fulfillments that we have had, we are often perceived as being arrogant and so on. There is a general... Yeah.
I was going to ask you this afterwards. You just took it on. I will get back to that also.
Right. So, and there's also gender element there also. So, it's less for men, more for women, and so on and so forth. So, all of these things are very, very strongly culturally ingrained within us, that when you're off the field, you don't experience it. But when you're on the field, you're suddenly expected to put that front is a little harder for us to be able to do it. So, we do come off as a lot more friendlier, softer, kinder, and so on, which can be misinterpreted as submission versus what you might see in a team that you're playing with might be seen as more dominant. We start to internalize it only because there is a behavioral or a body language difference when it comes to it. It's not right or wrong. It's just that because the body language is interpreted differently, very often than not we start to feel it. We start to feel it when we're on the floor as well. The third one is what is a language that we tend to use to describe a lot of these things. How often when we talk to our teams, or when the captain talks about our performance or thinks about our performance, or when the team strategizes, what kind of words do we use? Very often, because there is a certain degree of anxiety and fear included into our general way of having conversations, we tend to look at it as either like, if we don't do this, then
What not to do if it doesn't happen.
if it doesn't happen, what if this doesn't happen? So very often, the way we have conversations itself is very fear inducing and not necessarily confidence driven, versus if you were to look at a language model of a player that has has achieved a lot of success consistently, so their language model will be very different. It'll be like, when we go there, when we do things. It's not if, but
It's
rather when.
Nice.
So it's very important that we pay attention to these things and then try and alter these smaller things that can make a profound difference when you're actually playing.
The one thing that you said, and it struck a chord with me. So when we see it in another team, all these three aspects, there's a tendency as an audience, as whatever, to look at it in awe.
Yeah.
But when it hits closer to home, we brand that athlete or that attitude or that behavior as an attitude.
Yeah.
And not the right kind. So that's a very cultural thing, or it's a very prejudiced way of also looking at the athlete.
Yeah.
No, that is exactly what brought success as a group to another country. But when we see it, why does it scare us? Why does it scare? I think it scares a lot of people. Even people in position.
Absolutely, because we're not used to that. It's a very cultural thing that we expect certain behaviors, a certain decorum, or certain attitudes to be present in different contexts. Now, when we're learning it for the first time, it's very difficult to control it. But if you've mastered it, you know how you want to work around. So a player who's just budding and learning to develop that may behave differently in different contexts, which we may not approve of. But we fail to understand that it is a skill that the player is learning to develop. So we don't exercise patience, or we don't exercise calmness, or we don't exercise guidance in those spaces. We only look at it as something that we approve or we disapprove of.
You probably exercise authority in those spaces.
Exactly. Which is very difficult for the player to understand and value that feedback as well.
Because this is a conversation that I was having recently with another coach, saying the attitude that player has, when I say attitude, not the right, it is the behavior. Let me put the behavior that player has is something that's needed to be successful.
Yeah.
It's about how we as coaches help that player manage it.
Yep.
As opposed to saying don't behave that way.
Correct.
So if I were to manage it, again the third point that you said, what are the words, what is the language that is being used?
Yeah.
Really matters, right?
Yep.
And it seems to have a large impact. Now the other thing, language, one more thing that comes in language is in the recently concluded Men's World Cup, or now when Scotland is playing in the Women's World Cup, they will come with a tag called Associate Nation.
Right.
Which some countries take it up as a challenge and rise above it, like Afghanistan have in the men's circuit. But it takes a lot
Right.
to do it.
Right.
So when they come with this tag of Associate Nation, how much do you think it actually kind of pulls them down? As opposed to saying there are 8 teams competing in this World Cup.
So this is also very important, the word associate teams and so on. It's very, what do you say? It comes with its own set of skepticism. The audience who views a player who's performing at that capacity, or the teams that are seen as more dominant, there's always a certain degree of skepticism involved. So even if they do achieve and even if they do win, the skepticism doesn't go away.
Because we call it an upset.
Correct.
This team upset, there's nothing upsetting about it. They won.
It's something to be rejoicing, essentially.
So the terms that as a commentator also, I avoid using it, but it's a huge upset. Australia has been defeated by the Associate Nation. It's not an upset. So when the skepticism comes in every small way.
It comes in, exactly. So the intentional side effect, I won't say unintentional, unintentional side
Completely
effect here is that the next time when they come back into the space, they still have to prove themselves.
Exactly.
But that is a mindset that doesn't alter someone who's already made it. So it still gives the other teams a much bigger advantage because they don't have to prove anything all the time. They've already done enough. Versus any other team that's trying to rise to the top, even if they've consistently performed, they still feel like they need to prove it. And these things are very, very subtle but extremely significant when you go into the teams. And this happens across most games.
And it also, if it's happening in a team environment, imagine how it feels to be competing, for example, in tennis, when a player who is not ranked comes to the finals. I mean, the kind of talk that's going to happen for that player, for them to rise above that ranks literally, it's going to be tough.
Absolutely. Really, all of this does boil down into the language space because if a person who is not seeded but is won a tournament, very often they're not, it's more likely that it's attributed to luck than anything else. Correct. And that puts a tremendous amount of the pressure on the player to perform against the next tournament, that itself can bog them down in being able to perform. This happened, I'm not able to recollect the player's name. This happened time and time again.
Oh,
and
yeah,
that makes it very, very
pretty
difficult.
often.
Yeah.
When an unseeded player does well, as you said, the term luck very often comes into play. On that particular day, it's the processes that player followed and the performance has kind of gotten better.
So you take the win away from the person who's actually put in the effort and you still give it to the person who's already performed. And that might happen even in our games.
That's such a brilliant point. Oh yeah, you take the win away from them, right? That's how it feels when you say it's an upset.
Exactly.
So this, if I were to, as a coach or as the systems, we say, create this performance environment. One of the best examples we can bring in is in 2011 when Indian men's team won the World Cup under Gary Kirsten. If you read the book by Paddy Upton, Barefoot Coaching, that's the name of the book. He speaks about how there's no coaching involved, but the kind of attitudes that he changed around over the build up to the World Cup without actually mentioning the World Cup or winning it or the champions was something that they made a conscious effort towards. And that performance environment that came in has been reasonably well sustained in the years after. Maybe we didn't win a World Cup until recently. But then it's that environment that was created had its ups and downs. There were some individual brilliances. So how important is it we create this environment? What would you call a performance environment? How would you define it?
A performance environment is extremely nourishing. They get information, they get accessibility, they get guidance when they need it and so on. And every player has the opportunity to exercise these resources in the way in which they feel fit for their performances. So that is sort of that helps build a performance environment for the individuals. We have a lot of changes that we have to make on our part and very conscious changes that we need to make. It's not something that happens immediately or in a year or two. It's a process of that entire change. So it needs to start with very significant goals or expectations that we have in mind to be able to bring that sort of an effect. The first thing that we as an individual or as a team that we tend to do is we need to really remove this tendency to take the win away from the player, even at a training capacity. I can give you very simple examples. Let's say there are two players who are there. One's name is Sita, the other person's name is Parvati. They both are playing, they both are high performing, they both have a relatively good career that everyone can perceive ahead of them. And for some reason, one of them gets injured. A very common way of all of us addressing that selection or that win in that space is if only Sita was not injured, then she could have also performed, she could have also competed. Then what happens to Parvati who's listening to this?
You're taking the win away.
You're taking the win away from her and giving it to this person. Now you're also putting this Sita in a position saying, if only I'd played, which will push her into that position of having to play even if she's feeling injured or even if she's feeling. You're taking that recovery, you're taking that space away from her. But in most performance games, such environmental or incidental experiences will always be there. There'll be a team that would have practiced really well, but on that particular day, either because of food poisoning or heat or whatever, they couldn't perform. Now you're taking the win away from that individual. You're taking the win away from the other team who could manage those situations. Now this is what makes sports interesting. This is what makes sportsmanship wonderful. But we're taking it away by doing these kind of conversations. And that's a very good place for us to start first. So that we ensure that everything, whether it's the advantages or the disadvantages that the person has, they feel like they're in control of it, and they feel like they're in the position to be able to decide what they want to do with it.
So that's how so building a performance environment involves one, allowing, I mean, two words that you said, success and failure. How are we going to treat that? I think determines a lot of in that environment.
Correct.
Would you say that?
Correct.
All right. So now, with the way competition is coming, we talk about the World Cup. Every time we say World Cup, once in 2 years or once in 4 years, as it is with the 50 overs, it comes in with its own set of expectations. Because being a world champion has, you can, bragging rights belong to that team. If I were to look at teams that have won it, like in Australia and England, why is it that they never are able to, why aren't they sitting on their laurels and feeling comfortable with it? What is it that pushes them more every year? Your performance environment, all that. But still, they come back out there feeling that they have to prove themselves again and again. And unabashedly so.
So again, there's an underlying psychological narrative that is a part of what it means to prove themselves. We are talking about teams that, when they say proving themselves, the competition is maximum within the team themselves, or their previous, or the teams that have preceded them. So that's essentially the only level of competition that they feel that they might have. A team that has to rise overall, their sense of having to prove themselves is not only towards their own team members, but also to the entire world that is there. So the heaviness of expectation in one narrative is far more than the heaviness that is there on the other narrative.
But why is it that feels that seems lighter? I mean, typically shouldn't the ones who have already won it many times feel it more, because there's a burden on them to emulate that?
The narrative that is present on the consequences of not proving is not such a huge fall when compared to what we feel.
So it is what happens after that allows them to continue to be the way. Whereas for a team that hasn't done so well, what happens after the fall could be much larger.
The fall can feel like as if it's not something that they can recover from, versus a team that is doing well or is dominant. They feel like the fall is something they can recover from.
That's a fantastic, great point. The fall part, it is not actually the winning, it's what happens after it, or after losing, or whatever you want to call it.
Correct.
All right. So
this again varies. There are teams that have recovered really well. There are teams that have probably had a misstep in one shot, who've had difficulty recovering. So it's an overall team mindset, but that's where the support system comes in place.
Every time I talk to you, I feel, why you haven't done anything close to enough. You make me, I go back feeling failed.
No.
I'm just kidding, I don't feel that very often. So the next, one thing that's really struck me now is, we've been speaking about how Indian system is also evolving. It's great to know that the Indian team is now going to work with a psychologist to help them through this phase. It's been about couple of 3-4 months. There's been a lot of back end work that's been happening with individuals. A lot of players have been getting through. So do you think this is the start of something that probably not just cricket, but every sport could take a leaf out of? And how will it be, how is it going to be now that it's into the system?
Absolutely, this is one of the best news that we've been celebrating on, that we have a sports psychologist on board the Indian cricket team. I think it's quite significant, but I also think that it's not something that can be done in isolation. As in, just like how every other support member works together to ensure that the player performs really well, recovers well, the sports psychologist also has to be a part of that entire system, and we need to sort of make it multidisciplinary in the sense that there is knowledge sharing that happens on both fronts, and thereby it builds itself into the ecosystem and the ethos. So there, it takes a little bit of effort, it takes a little bit of having to show through results and so on. So I would like the entire system to be a little bit more patient to see how having a psychologist on board does make a difference in terms of impact performance.
The challenge that the psychologist is going to have is one, okay, they have a set of players now, 15 players. These players could change.
Yeah.
The support staff will change.
Yeah.
It's very difficult if the psychologist also keeps changing.
Yeah.
For the player and the person who's coming in.
Yeah.
So there, like you said, there has to be longevity in terms of a sustained work that happens.
Correct.
Now, say this person remains constant, but everything around them is variable. How do you people then handle it? How is it that you are going to make yourselves relevant at every given point in time? Because let us say you are in there for the long haul.
Yeah.
But the people around you are going to change, and their expectations, demands could change.
Yeah.
I'm going to pose a question. How do you handle it?
It is a learning curve for sure. Learning curve as in each game has a particular space in which they function, the flexibility of training, everything works. It's very important that we're equally flexible in that space. Not everything is a couch talk session that needs to happen. So if that is the case, the volume of the number of people that we need to address will become too much, and then it brings in that unsustainability element. I feel a combination of support elements, like you have smaller exercises, group sessions, support groups, and so on, can really make that difference. And very targeted, controlled one-on-one sessions will definitely help, and so on. It's very important that the training schedules does facilitate and give time for psychological work also to happen meanwhile, which takes time away from another training or intervention process. So there again, it's when it's multidisciplinary, it works. It's a process. So there's going to be a bit of trial and error elements that are there. But
like you rightly said, they should have the time for it. They should not, players nor the coaches, because of their lack of information, cannot say this is taking time away from their physical exercise. Correct. They should understand that it's all inbuilt in towards growth.
Correct. So it's going to take a while to stabilize. When I say a while, not too long a period of time, maybe 6 months to a year or so. But after that, when it's built into the system, it's very smooth and very comfortable. Because like the conversation that we discussed, mind games are a lot.
Oh yeah.
The psychological warfare that happens in competitive elements is a lot. So it's important that
biggest mind game, like we spoke before this, was how the Australian team, when they played the finals in India, said we will silence the crowd.
Yeah.
Because it's the support runs in lakhs. And they did exactly that.
Yep.
But it surprised me that they said it and they did it.
Yeah, because there are particular techniques that you can use to ensure that happens. It's very well validated and well documented elements. The point is, when you're a psychology major, or when you've had experience within the psychological elements, these rules are something that's easy to understand. But when you're not exposed to it and you're learning these rules for the first time, there is a learning curve involved, and that learning curve is what takes time. And since we spoke about language as well, how do we mindfully change the language in which we are talking to each other is a transitionary process. We're so used to talking a particular way, but that would involve everybody in the environment to change their way they speak. Parents, physiotherapists, psychotherapists, coaches, players, every one of their languages needs to change. So those are all the processes that are involved. But once we make
winning the World Cup is not as easy as one just... it's happened for... No, it's never going to be easy.
Yeah.
I'm saying, for a team that's been winning, like an Australia or an England that we keep talking about, the system has been so well set in place that it's a well-oiled machinery that allows for performance to be the performance indicators are very different from the ones that other nations are considering, and moving towards that change is going to be it can't be an overnight thing. And I'm sure that as a big fan of Indian cricket, the change has started as far as India goes, and this edition of the World Cup edition that I had a chat with was more or less, quite honestly, for me to understand what it takes for India to probably do well, and see if I can help a couple of lovely points in over there about how mindful we should be about the language that we should speak, and the way what we consider success and failure needs to definitely start altering, not just at the highest level, but I'm sure it has to start altering at the grassroots level, at the amateur level, if we are to make a change in the long run. So again, thank you so much, Poornima, for this chat. Like I said, I go back every time with a lot more information and processing, and then I come back with more questions to you.
Happy to help.
And if you have such queries, or you want to reach out, or you want to know what, if you want more information, or you want to engage with Poornima and Precision Mental Health, then do look at the description below, and you will have all the details as to how to reach out to them, and you can seek their help on the professional front as well. And if you like what you hear, do like, share and subscribe to Coach Aarti. Thank you so much.